Hello everyone, my name is Aakanksh Gurnani, and welcome to my YouTube channel Neuro Chat with AG. On this channel, I plan to cover topics that are closest to my heart and support the neurodiverse community. Topics related to neurodiversity, autism spectrum disorder, and more. On the channel, I will interview thought leaders, esteemed researchers, scientists, professors, doctors, and psychologists, seeking their views and updates on their latest work, research, etc. I will also chat with parents of neurodiverse kids and adults and talk about experiences of neurodiverse individuals. My guest today, Mr. Guy Shahar, is the founder and CEO of Heartful Healing, a TEDx speaker, an author, and the founder of the Transforming Autism Project, a UK-based charity dedicated to transforming public perception and treatment of autism. Drawing from his personal experiences as a father of an autistic child, Guy has become a passionate advocate for early intervention and supportive approaches to autism. His work focuses on providing education, resources, and support to families and professionals to help autistic individuals thrive. Through his leadership at the Transforming Autism Project, Guy aims to create a more inclusive and understanding society for autistic people. Mr. Guy Shahar is also the author of Leaving Town, a collection of short stories, and Transforming Autism, his story after discovering his son was autistic to give him the very best prospects for his future life. Mr. Shahar, welcome, and thank you very much for the time today.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Okay, to start us off, could you please talk about your journey and what led you to focus on autism?
Yeah, it was, the first step was when we discovered that my son was autistic, and he was about 1.5 years old. And until that point, he'd been a very happy, very communicative, very interactive baby. And at about between 1.25, he started to sort of disconnect from us in certain ways, and to sort of start living in his own world, start to sort of be actually irritated by any communication with us. And we were really at a loss. And he spent a lot more of his time in a lot of distress as well. We didn't know what was going on. We didn't know that autism was a thing. We didn't really know what it was. It was my mum who had the idea that he might be autistic to begin with. And then it became clearer that he was autistic. And we didn't know what to do. We didn't know what to do to help him. We felt that we were losing him. And we found a center in Israel called the Mifni Center, where we went as a family. And they were just really amazing because we call it early intervention, but it wasn't intervention in any sort of medical sense. And it wasn't intervention in any sort of sense that pathologized autism or made it into something that was bad or something that was a defect. They simply treated him and played with him in a way that was respectful of him, in a way that was inclusive. And that in itself was enough for like enormous transformations to take place like we couldn't have imagined. So we went there as really a family in an enormous amount of distress who thought we had an enormous problem and didn't know what to do about it. And we left there as a really happy family unit. And the only difference had been that we'd learned how to behave towards him in a respectful way, in a way that honored who he was, in a way that interacted with him where he is now, where he was at that time, and that gave him the message that he was safe, he was understood, he was included, he was secure, and that's all it needed. So that was my entry point.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very powerful story. What are your views on early intervention for children on the spectrum? And how did you see that, like, as you mentioned, but like more specifically, help in the case of your son?
Yeah, well, what happened with my son, it really shaped how I understand things now in many ways. And the reason early intervention is important is because, it's easy to say, and people often say that's the age where you make the lifelong difference because it's the formative years and so on and so on. And that's all true. But the way I understand it now, additionally, is that it's almost a question of what autism is. Is it something that's a problem? Is it something that the child has that's a defect in some way? Because there is sorts of intervention that are based on that understanding, and personally, I don't feel those interventions are at all helpful. They might achieve short-term superficial results, but they give much more long-term difficulties to the child than they solve. Or is autism simply a different way of it's a different way that the nervous system works? That's all it is, really. It's a neurological difference. It's the nervous system functions in a different way. There are different things that put pressure on it, and different things that it's able to cope with well than you would find in a typical non-autistic person. So early intervention is really important, and an early intervention based on a really strong understanding of neurodiversity is important, because what you're actually doing is you're taking away from the child the potential for trauma, because trauma that happens in those it's not just that the child is developing, and that if we don't help them catch up with typical milestones, then they will suffer. That's not the issue. The issue is that the child is developing, and if they're subjected to traumatic experiences at the age when they're developing, those traumatic experiences are going to translate long term into a traumatized person, a traumatized adult, and an adult who is dysfunctional, not because they're autistic, but because they've had lots of experience of trauma at a very, very young and formative age. So by treating, and as I was talking about the approach that we learned with my son, about respecting him for who he was, creating a safe environment around him, enabling him to feel loved, cared for, understood, and accepted, then you're removing the potential for trauma. And when you remove the potential for trauma, you open up enormous possibilities for the future.
When parents find out their child is autistic, there is often a lot of stress, denial, and eventually acceptance. You talked about some of your experiences in your TED Talk. What has your journey been like on this mindset shift? And what is your suggestion for parents dealing with these emotions?
It's huge, and it's impossible to totally avoid, the journey that you're going to go on, because as a parent, it's not a journey that you chose. It's not a journey that you expected. And often it's a case of bringing up a child who's, the parent's typical initial response, and ours as well, sadly, was there's something wrong with the child. And so there's almost, you almost start off with this sort of sense of resentment, not of the child, but of just the situation that you're in. Why is this happening to me? It's a very indulgent sort of attitude, but it's part of the process. And over time, that hopefully shifts to an understanding that you're bringing up a child who's just different, who just works in a different way. And that doesn't detract from the relationship that you can have with that child. Actually, it can enhance the relationship, because, you've got to work at it a bit. You've got to work, there's been all sorts of research done, some really amazing research by a lady called Catherine Crompton at the University of Edinburgh. And she was comparing, she got random pairs of people together. So some of them were two autistic people, some of them were two non-autistic people, and some of them were one autistic and one non-autistic person. And she found that, she was doing all these objective measurements of their social interaction and how adept they were at social interaction. Contrary to a lot of expectations, she found that the autistic pairs and the non-autistic pairs were pretty much identical in their sort of social abilities and their social activities when measured objectively. And the pairs that really struggled were the autistic and non-autistic. It's not that one is better than the other or one is worse than the other. It's just that they function differently. And when you're bringing up an autistic child, the challenges are that you've got to learn that new way. You've got to learn to not only to love your child, that's the part that comes easy to a parent, but to accept your child, and that's a bigger thing, and then to understand your child, and that's a much bigger thing as well. And there's an opportunity in it. If the child is different and you put in the effort to understand them, and you have that achievement of not only understanding a person who works in a different way to you, but also nurturing that person, understanding them so well that you can show them that they're understood, and through showing that understanding, nurture them so that you can optimize their sense of well-being and optimize their future prospects. It's a wonderful thing, but it's a huge amount of work. And that huge amount of work, you can see it as a burden or you can see it as an opportunity. And what we did, and what, eventually, and what we would encourage everyone to do if they can, is to switch the thinking to that becoming an opportunity. And you're almost compelled to go on a journey of personal development that most people would never go on by free choice, that we would never have chosen to go on. But we reap the rewards of that journey because we've been forced to go on it.
Yeah, that was very nicely said. And there are also a lot of mental health issues parents of children on the spectrum face. And you mentioned in your book on how you face those as well. So how do you manage your health? And could you share some of the best practices you found for other parents as well?
It's part of again, it's the mindset shift. It's when we go from resenting the situation that we've been given, which is a natural first step, to accepting the situation we've been given, and then being grateful for the situation we've been given and everything that comes with it. That in itself is enough to sort of change the whole experience of parenting. And because the child is so sensitive, any child is so sensitive, and many autistic children more so, then you just feel a lot of satisfaction with that. And that's the biggest piece in terms of dealing with the mental health challenges. There's also a big part of it which is about looking after yourself, and by that I mean in the way that we think. It's so easy to be critical of ourselves, because when you're bringing up a child who's different from the child that you would be expecting to bring up and know how to bring up, it's so easy to be critical and to think, I'm not good enough, or I could have done this differently and it would have been better, and therefore I'm responsible for all of these terrible consequences. And really, to have any sort of meaningful and valuable mental health, we need to let go of all of that, and we need to acknowledge ourselves for what we are doing. We need to acknowledge that, like everybody else, we're doing our very, very best, and that's enough. It's in fact, it's all we can do. That's why it's enough. And we do need to be kind to ourselves, both in terms of how we think about ourselves, how we acknowledge ourselves, and also what demands we make on ourselves. It's not reasonable to expect a human being to be 100% attentive and diligent and hardworking all of the time. We need to carve out time for ourselves as well. If we're lucky enough to be in a partnership, if we've got two parents and they're both very equally committed to everything, take it in turns to sort of let someone have some time just to look after themselves, just to do something that they like doing. Really looking after ourselves and acknowledging what our needs are means that even if we spend a little bit less time with our child, then we're going to be so much more refreshed and so much more positive during that time, that the child will get more benefit from that.
In your book, you've also mentioned how the energy of your thoughts impacted the outcome of any situation with Daniel. So how did you change your approach to connecting with him?
I guess it's the idea that we learned during this period, that he was so perceptive and so tuned in to us, that if we would do what we thought we should do on the outside while feeling differently on the inside, it didn't work, because he was seeing the discrepancy. He was seeing something on the outside, and he was knowing that wasn't reflecting where we really were, and that would have been immensely confusing to him. So it was so important for us to become one, as in, I am the same on the inside as I am on the outside. But that brings its own challenges, because what do you do if you're feeling flat on the inside, or you're feeling angry on the inside, and you want to be the same inside outside? What do? You either let go of the anger, or you let go of that authenticity. So letting go of the authenticity isn't very it's not what you want to do, because you're undermining all of your efforts and everything else. And letting go of the anger just like that is something that's probably impractical to do. So it's almost like knowing what your limitations are, what your capacity, and we're constantly expanding our capacities in this area as well. I almost had a bit of a head start in this, because even though I didn't know it at the time, I'm also autistic myself. So, and for me, a lot of the, one big thing is I can't be different inside and outside. I can't feel one thing on the inside and show something different on the outside. I can't do it. And I know it's normal in society, and everyone, but I can't do it. So I've had years of experience and years of having to learn that if I want to behave in a certain way, I need to change myself to that in reality before I manifest anything on the outside. And over many years of having to do that, I've learned to be able to do that very quickly. And so that served me well. I mean, I guess for other people who haven't been through that, it's going to be a slower learning process as parents. But I think it's probably the only way that we can, it's the only way that we can go. And again, same as I said in the last question, it's so important to acknowledge the little steps that we make in that direction, instead of criticizing ourselves for the gap that there still is before we get to perfection, because there'll always be a huge gap before we get to perfection.
Speaking of that program where you're talking about, can you suggest any programs that remarkably impacted Daniel and that you wish all organizations could include as a part of their programs for neurominority individuals?
No, I don't think I can, because there aren't. There are. I mean, there are lots of things that I think are really helpful. So, I mean, and again, everybody will have their own preferences and have their own experiences of what works, and what works for one family might be different for another family. But so one thing I think is really, really helpful is craniosacral osteopathy. I really like that. Whenever we took my son to that, he always just seemed calmer and more settled. I mean, and we never did it long term very regularly. It might have led to enormous, deeper changes if we had. But even on that sort of day by day level, a session of craniosacral osteopathy was really amazing for him. In terms of sort of therapeutic treatments or interventions, it's like nothing can really beat really good development oriented child psychotherapy. That's what we experienced at the Mifni Center, the center we went to in Israel. That's what the charity that you mentioned at the beginning that I founded and I ran for 7 years. Now, fortunately, we've got a proper professional CEO, so it's really running much better now. And I'm still there as a founder. That's what we do as well. And we do it sort of, the Mifni Center works only with children up to 2 years old. We use, we do very intensive in-home therapy for children a bit older, up to about 4, through the charity. But you can find child psychotherapists who are specialized in this sort of approach, who can work with children of all ages, and it's a benefit whatever age. We just focus on the very early ages because that's where the biggest changes are noticeable. But at any age, that's if you get the right sort of developmental child psychotherapy, because really, essentially, that's about building a relationship with a child that's based on trust, that's based on creating a safe environment around them, And that's what's going to unlock a child's potential over the long term.
I've read a lot about depression-related issues in autistic children as they grow older. So what are your views on how depression-related issues can be addressed?
I'd say it's really similar through that sense of understanding and and a relationship and trust. I think often the roots of the depression, if it is related to their experience as an autistic person, is in that feeling that's very, very prevalent amongst autistic people. I know it firsthand as well, of feeling that you're not understood by the people around you. They might love you, they might accept you, but they don't understand. And that that feeling of not being understood it's a feeling of being understood is a fundamental human need, and the absence of it is really, it can be devastating. So the best thing to do preemptively, I guess, to avoid depression, or in a corrective way as well, if depression has arisen, personally, I think probably is creating a relationship, listening, understanding, hearing, showing that person that they're understood and that they're valued. There's a guy called Johann Hari, who's really brilliant. He talks a lot about addiction and depression and things like this, and more recently about, technology addiction, which is related to depression as well. And he's given a couple of really amazing TED Talks. And in one of them, he was talking about in a third world country, there was, some farmer who became depressed and sort of separated himself from the local community. And the way that they dealt with that was to sort of go there, to make a deliberate effort that a load of them would just go there, just sit with him and just be with him. And that in itself was enough to sort of slowly and gradually lift him out of his depression, because it gave him that sense of being a part of something.
So in the charity organization that you run, how does it use those therapies you mentioned to help children on the spectrum?
So we have a couple of child psychotherapists who go. For each family, you have a child psychotherapist and an occupational therapist. They go to the family home. They each go. It varies depending on the family, but typically they'll each go once a week, and they'll work very closely with the child. But in doing so, they'll be working closely with the parent as well. And they'll be helping the parent. And it's so crucial. I mean, any sort of intervention, if it doesn't involve the parents, it can't be successful, because it's the parents who are with the child most of the time. And if you're not teaching the parents how to best relate to the child and build that trusting, loving, understanding relationship that we've been talking about, they need to be very, very deeply involved in that. So a large part of what we do is to help the parents get to that point where they feel comfortable building that relationship with the child, where they can be so responsive to what the child's really needing, that at the beginning they might be not be that conscious of, and we help them understand what their child is actually really communicating, what the child is needing, how to respond to the child in a way that will make them feel that they're understood, and they can trust their parent to understand them, because that trust is so important. And we reinforce it and we build it by showing that understanding to the child. So that's what we do. So we do it for an initial period of 6 weeks, but then we do it on an ongoing basis for a year or more, often with a family, for as long as we feel and they feel that they can benefit from it. And it's had really sort of quite amazing results with families. It's really sort of helped facilitate those relationships which are foundational to the well-being of a child, and to building a foundational for the future of the child.
Thank you. That seems like an amazing way to parents involved as well and make the relationship stronger. And I always thought that autism was assessed by a pediatrician at an early age, but many adults share their stories yourself about how they learned that they were autistic at a much older age. So what are your thoughts about these assessments for autism, and whether continuous assessment by your physician is necessary?
I didn't go through that process myself. And, I did go and see somebody when I started to think, okay, maybe I'm autistic. I did go to see somebody, and he was really sort of quite dismissive of me. And he said, no, you're not autistic. Obviously, you're not autistic. You look me directly in the eye. You're responding directly to the questions that I ask. You have a level of empathy that you wouldn't expect in an autistic person. And at the time, I thought, well, okay, maybe I'm not autistic then. Actually, what I understand now is that that's really such a limited and one-dimensional understanding of what autism is that that he was showing me. And I mentioned this. I met Tony Attwood. He's a very well-renowned specialist in autism. And he was in the UK. He was visiting family. I did an interview with him for the charity's YouTube channel, and we were talking before the interview, and I was saying that I think I might be autistic. He said, yeah, I can see that. I've had 40 years of experience of this. It's quite obvious. But I told him about this experience I'd had. He said, yeah, but you're not going to get a diagnosis unless you find somebody who's really specialist, really extremely specialist and extremely well trained in identifying autism in adults who've lived most of their life without knowing that they're autistic. Because not always, but what most often happens with those sorts of people like me, is that we live, decades, and the only way we can get through those decades is to do what is known as masking, which is to behave in a way that is not necessarily true to who we are, not necessarily. I mean, it's not self-deception in any way, and it's not lying, and it's not masking in the sense of trying to deceive anybody. It's just trying to fit in the way that everybody tries to fit in, and we just think, just trying to fit in just like everybody else. What we don't realize is that, what that requires of us, because we're different in how we work fundamentally, is so much greater than is required for somebody who's not autistic and much more naturally fits in with other people's expectations. They need to do small tweaks. We need to do huge transformations of our whole way of being. So it's not always obvious that somebody who is autistic and hasn't known that for decades is going to be confirmed in that analysis by a specialist, unless that person is really specialist and really well evolved in their understanding. So I decided not to go down that path. Other people might have different priorities and different reasons. They might, if they're employed, for example, in a job, and their employer is not sort of aware of such things, they might need to get a piece of paper to say that they're autistic in order to attain certain accommodations. I sort of basically found that mainstream work wasn't possible. It wasn't feasible for me. I did about 10 years of it. It wasn't feasible for me over the long term because those accommodations weren't available to me. So I had to find a different lifestyle. And those were accommodations both in the culture, this sort of almost this very hard-nosed, materialistic, domineering culture is, it's not good typically for an autistic person, but also things like just the physical environment even. So you'd have these like really bright fluorescent lights over the top of your head, and if you said to anybody, those are a bit bright for me, they're affecting how I feel, they're affecting how I'm able to maintain my energy during the day, when I said things like that, I was often seen as a problem creator, or somebody who wanted some sort of special, wanted some sort of special treatment, or wanted to compensate for some psychological defects with trying to get special favors or something like this. It wasn't taken at face value as a sensory issue, which is what it was. And for some people, it might be necessary to get that piece of paper in order to get those accommodations. For me, it was like I'd already gone past that point, and I'd already left the world of regular employment.
A small follow-up question I had that I was just thinking about when you were answering that question is in the UK, I don't know about this, but how does like the training work in terms of learning about autism for like pediatricians or psychologists? Because I know here, like, it's very specialized and usually only child and development psychiatry, like that's what you have to do, get exposed to that even. So
Yeah, so I don't know, honestly, but in my experience, what I suspect is what it really feels like is that everybody wants to sort of maybe the people don't want to do the training, but every organization wants their employees to be autism trained. It's a great thing to have, it's a great title to have, and you can put on your marketing, oh, so we are autism aware, we've done this training or that training. But it also seems to be very superficial. It seems to be on the level of, we want to tick a box. We want to sort of say that we've done this, and we're not really serious about implementing it. And we're not really serious about providing good quality education. And we're not really serious about ensuring that that good quality education is something that can truly and practically bring meaningful benefits in our daily work. I think, from what you say about America, maybe we're a small step further along, but there's still an enormous way to go.
So I volunteer with neuro-minority children a lot, and I've seen different emotions in every individual and also different reactions to feeling anxious or something else. So are there any best practices for working with children on the spectrum, and especially in terms of stimming or something else?
Yeah. It's really the same as I think I've answered all the questions in the same way. Sorry if it's getting boring, but it's again about the relationship. It's again about building that relationship, showing that understanding, spending time to get to know the child and to show that child that you're listening to them, you understand them, you're responding to what their needs actually are because you see and you understand those needs and you accept them, and that, if they are stimming, you just accept that that's who they are and that's what they need to do. There's a great guy who I do a podcast with called Andrew Sheehan. And he often gives the example, and I can't remember any of these examples now, but he often gives examples about how stimming is not something that's exclusive to autistic people. Everybody stims. We all stim in ways that are, that we need in order to regulate our emotions. The only difference is that the stimming that non-autistic people do, it might be playing with a pencil when you're a bit nervous, twisting it around in your hand. It might be turning to alcohol or something more extreme like that. That's socially acceptable because there's a large number of people who do that sort of thing. The ways that autistic people might stim themselves, they might be a little bit more, they might stand out a bit more because they're not the sorts of things that non-autistic people need to do. They're the sorts of things that autistic people need to do. So it's about accepting the stimming. It's about accepting that this is how that person regulates their emotions. It might be different from how I regulate mine, but so what? What's the point in neurodiversity if we're not going to respect those differences?
I don't think you're really repeating your answers that much.
Right.
So
good.
And one thing about what you just mentioned, so in regards to neurodiversity, there's a big debate, neurodiversity versus neuro-minority individuals. It's a pretty controversial topic, but if you're okay with sharing, I wanted to hear your opinion on that.
When you say between, do you mean the language? You're talking about the language?
Yes.
Right. Okay. I think so. This is my personal thing, and I don't want to, upset anybody. I don't want to sort of step on any toes or anything. So this is just one person. The idea of neurodiversity is so powerful. It's taken at its core, it can transform everything because it's about totally resetting the way that we are thinking about not only autism but about any human being. Actually, it doesn't make any sense to make a value judgment about anybody else because everything that, even a sort of, got some sort of pathological criminal or something like this, you might need to discipline them by locking them up to protect society, and that's a practical consideration, but it makes no sense to make any sort of moral distinction between anybody, because everybody is comes into the world with a different neurology, and it's just different, and that's it. And in terms of autistic people, it's just another type of person. It's just another, just the autistic spectrum itself is so diverse, and some parts of it will overlap what's typically thought of as neurotypical more than it will overlap with somebody at the other end of the autism spectrum, and vice versa. So yeah, neurodiversity is so powerful, and the difficulty is, and this is when we get these almost contrived expressions that, to me, forgive me, like Neuro-Minority might be one of them, or it might not be, I don't know, depending on how it's used. Neurodiverse is another one that's really horrible. What it seems to me is happening is that people are taking this neuro from neurodiversity so that it fits in with the new thinking, or what's supposed to be the new thinking. And they're creating new words and new constructs, which unfortunately seem to be simply a more acceptable way of bringing the old thinking back. So if you say something like, "Oh, this is a neurodiverse person," what you're actually doing with that one statement is you're driving a stake through the heart of neurodiversity, to use overly dramatic language, because what you're saying is, oh, actually there is a norm, there is something to diverge from, apart from being grammatically incorrect. I guess neurodivergent, I guess, is grammatically correct, but you're actually saying that there is a norm to diverge from, and that's against the very concept of neurodiversity.
For my last question, is there anything else you would like to add or suggest to parents?
Building the relationship, take the time to sort of build that trust, build that understanding, acceptance of the child, acceptance of yourself, just all of the principles we've been talking about. They're great words, and they're great things and nice things to say, but if you go into each one of them can be totally transformative.
Mr. Shahar, thank you so much for taking the time to be interviewed by me. I really appreciate this opportunity to discuss transforming autism literally, and I'm very grateful for your insights and considerations, because I learned a lot today that I didn't know yesterday. So thank you.
Okay, good. Thank you.